In what seemed to be quite the surprise to the soldiers guarding the council station, their check on Reprig's claims about moving around freely, with the blessing of the humans of all people, came back with the situation completely cleared.
"It seems like you are free to go,"
the Estaxai soldier mumbled once he had conveyed the situation. Though, even as he said it, he still seemed to be quite hesitant about it for some reason, as if he suspected that something about what he was doing wasn't quite right. Still, as he seemingly had absolutely nothing to go on for that apart from a vague gut feeling, he was left with no choice but to simply let the Sipperslang go on his merry way.
"Thank you,"
Reprig replied with a nod, his trunk wiggling a bit as he pushed himself back into a fully upright position, supporting less of his weight on his crutch once again.
"Have a pleasant rest of your day, and success to you."
"Success to you," the soldier answered, in what seemed to be more of an automatic response than any intentional politeness. Reprig, seeming unperturbed by that, turned and took a few hobbling steps to more directly join up with Nafmir Duralfren. The Zadiatos looked down at the limping Deathworlder he had been sent here to fetch. All in all, he wasn't impressed. The warrant officer's small trunk was quite befitting of his minuscule stature and the negligible impression he left, and his crippling played into that only slightly, though the fact that he had suffered it through the fault of his ego alone certainly spoke far more against him than the mere fact that he had gotten injured. Truly a picture of disposable, far from essential, but at the very least probably not entirely useless. After having to slightly laboriously turn in place, during which the Sipperslang patiently waited for him, Nafmir Duralfren took the lead, beginning to show the small creature the way towards his temporary domain. At this point, he had laid down the large welcome sign she had held in his trunk earlier, and he simply left it laying there as he turned to leave.
"I heard you were quite familiar with my predecessor,"
Nafmir Duralfren began to speak, after they had moved somewhat out of the earshot of the suspicious soldier. Despite their respective associations, he had actually not had the personal pleasure with this asset of his matriarch yet. Now that it was the time, he would have to test the waters, see what he was really working with, and for that, one of the few things he did know about the warrant officer was going to be instrumental.
"A void left in your interpersonal world, I am sure. However, one that I intend to try and fill to my best."
His sentence stopped ever so slightly short in mild surprise. As he spoke that last part, he had intended to turn his head around to look directly at the Sipperslang. He wanted to let him feel his presence, the pressure behind his words. However, when he did finally turn his head to put his plan into action, he found that actually looking at the Deathworlder turned out to be a little more complicated than he had intended. Nafmir Duralfren knew he was there. His large ears very clearly picked up on the clacking of the man's walking aid. Yet, when he tried to follow the sound with his eyes to look directly at him, it appeared like the Deathworlder was not actually walking on the side of him that he had turned towards. Annoyed by his own blunder, but knowing better than to call attention to it, Nafmir Duralfren decided to simply play it off, swiftly turning his head to the other side to try and salvage what was left of the effect, only to see that his left side was just as devoid of any Sipperslang clacking along as his right had been. He craned his head a bit further, using his long neck to lean a bit more into his field of view to make sure that Reprig hadn't actually been walking behind him this entire time. However, his flank was just as clear as his sides. He stayed the constant movements of his ears for a moment, lifting them up to listen more closely for a bit. Had he been fooled by some other noise and actually lost the Deathworlder on accident this entire time? No, he could still hear it. The prominent clacking of that crutch was there for sure. He heard clearly it walking right along with him. Once more he turned his head, trying to pinpoint its location, and then one more time. But nothing. It seemed from the sound that the small man was always just out of his sight, no matter where or how much he turned. Was the Deathworlder hiding from him? It almost felt like he was. However, based on the sound of the crutch, it also didn't quite seem like it. If Reprig was always rushing to stand on the other side of his body, whenever he turned, he would expect to hear a sign of that. A speeding up of the clacks, hasty steps, as the small creature hurried to get into the right position before the dwarf friend's eyes could find him. But instead, his steps seemed to remain rather constant, at least as far as the clacking of his crutch was concerned. They didn't particularly speed up, slow down, or become in any way irregular whenever Nafmir Dwarfriend moved, indicating that the Deathworlder was just sort of chugging along with him instead of making any deliberate movements to stay out of sight. It really was a bit...
Yes, I was familiar with the previous holder of the title you aspired to.
Reprig suddenly began to speak, seemingly losing the patience to wait for Nafmir Dwarfriend to actually finish his sentence. He still remained out of sight, but with his voice constantly sounding now, it was far easier to tell that he was moving around somewhere on the Dwarfriend's left side. Not wanting to miss the opportunity, Nafmir Dwarfriend quickly brought his head around, and there he was. The Zodiatos didn't even have to crane his neck or search any closer this time. When he turned his head, Reprig was simply there, casually walking right at his side, as if the last minute or so of his ghostly disappearing act hadn't even occurred.
But I must say, during that time, I got far more familiar with the man instead of the title.
Reprig continued his statement, seeming entirely indifferent on whether Nafmir Dwarfriend was looking at him, as he spoke while he leaned onto his crutch heavily with each step that he took.
Not a pleasant experience, to be quite honest, but judging by your tone, I am sure that you're aware of that.
Finally, the Deathworlder lifted his head slightly to meet the Dwarfriend's gaze. The Zodiatus could feel the eye contact, even if his own eyes weren't quite sharp enough to actually make out the small baubles which would be those of the Sipperslang. The Colossus released a brief but sharp breath from his trunk. It wasn't quite strong enough to cause any trumpeting, but it was certainly on the edge.
"You would insult my predecessor to my face?"
he wondered aloud, his voice somewhat incredulous while also carrying a hint of a warning.
"He was a ruffian and a brute,"
Reprig replied near immediately, without any hint of hesitation to his voice, pulling his eyes away from those of the Zodiatos to look straight ahead again.
"An all-around unpleasant person to be around, and hardly able to even hold, much less carry a conversation. His only good feature was his devotion, and it was by far not enough to weigh up his many, many shortcomings."
He then simply left that statement to sit, not making any effort to soften the blow or otherwise indicate that he meant no offence. He simply kept walking, waiting for the new aspiring Dwarfriend to react. And react he did.
"Sounds like there is quite the room for improvement,"
Nafmir Dwarfriend commented in an amused scoff, once a few seconds had passed. All of the earlier warning had disappeared from his voice. He then granted himself a few more moments to assess the Deathworlder further. It seemed like the man might have still had his ego problems. He was certainly very bold, didn't even flinch when confronted with someone almost 100 times his total size. Then again, it didn't really seem like he tried to outright goad or challenge the Zodiatos. His words did seem a little more deliberate than that. Maybe he actually had some power in that small brain of his, and managed to read the Nafmir Dwarfriend's demeanour. Or maybe he knew a little more than he let on, already suspecting the aspiring's own low opinions about his predecessor. He probably wasn't an idiot, at least not a complete one.
"There most certainly is,"
Reprig confirmed the Dwarfriend's statement with a dismissive movement of his head. The slightly spotted fur along his back rustled a bit, his hackles seemingly beginning to raise at the mere thought of the late Dwarfriend.
"Being better than him is about as hard as clearing a hurdle that is laying on the floor."
The Zodiatos scoffed once again, the ends of his trunk coming up to thoughtfully rub at his chin and the base of his tusks.
"You seem to have quite a lot to say,"
he commented, a bit surprised at how immediately talkative the warrant officer was with a supposed stranger. Reprig nodded slowly.
"Quite a few things I would have liked to tell him while he was still alive," he confirmed,
seeming to imply that he was using the Zodiatos bull as a sort of surrogate for many of the long-held-back comments he had pent up somewhere inside of him.
"Now that he's dead, he won't get to retaliate for it."
At that, the Nafmir Dwarfriend released a somewhat scornful trumpeting from one of his trunk's ends.
"How cowardly,"
he chided, his slowly rising opinion of the Deathworlder immediately dropping again. Now, it wasn't because the Deathworlder hadn't walked up to something that may as well have been a walking house to him and insulted that to his face. Basic self-preservation wasn't exactly something that only spineless people had. Speaking about it so callously after the fact, on the other hand.
I really was.
Reprig very simply confirmed the attack, a very faint hint of resignation in his voice, as he lowered his head slightly. The statement seemed to carry far more weight for the small man than just the one simple admonishment.
But to be fair, so was he.
Navmir Doralfriend tilted his head in surprise at that. Of all the words that could have left the Sipperslang's mouth, he had not expected those.
Doralfriend? A coward?
He asked, with mild offence in his voice. Unlike his played-up indignation at the idea that his predecessor was rather unrefined earlier, this time the insult he felt was quite real. There were many things he could accept, one of the former Doralfriends being branded as, but a coward? Nobody who gained this most prestigious of titles could be anything close to that. And the idea that he could be aspiring towards a position that a coward held before him was something that stung right into his sense of accomplishment.
He died on his feet, standing against overwhelming odds. You want to brand someone like that with cowardice?
Reprig clicked his tongue, his trunk lifting noticeably as he sneered at the notion.
Just because someone is too dumb to know fear does not mean he cannot be a coward, he retorted,
openly dismissing the idea that dying a brave death disqualified you from that designation.
The late Doralfriend only ever did what was easiest. When he felt he had power, he enforced it in every way he could. When a way was paid for him, he walked it without a second thought. The only steps he ever took were stepping right into footprints, quite often his very own. He was like a river, always following the path of least resistance. And if resistance threatened to arise, he was always swift to strike it down rashly.
Navmir Doralfriend couldn't help but feel as if he detected a certain sense of reminiscence and self-reflection in the Sipperslang's voice. There was obviously more to it than just his dislike of a dead man, even if there was certainly more than just a little bit of that as well.
Even in death, he didn't see what was right in front of him.
Reprig finally finished his statement with a deliberate sigh.
He wasn't braving the power before him. He was attempting to prevent that which would follow after it, even at the expense of his life.
Navmir Doralfriend's lips kneaded against the base of his trunk a bit, one end of his trunk rubbing along the other.
That still does not sound cowardly to me, he stated honestly.
Although he tried to follow the warrant officer's thought process, he had to admit that he did not arrive at the same conclusion in the end, try as he might. Reprig's tough tail gave a single wag, and with his next step, he brought the crutch down onto the ground a bit harder than before.
It is a matter of perspective, I suppose.
He then dismissed the topic. His words had a bit of a finality to them, almost as if he was not interested in continuing this path of the conversation if the Zodiatos Bull did not understand him by this point. It was certainly interesting that he...
I must admit...
Reprig suddenly interrupted Navmir Doralfriend's thought, as he simply kept talking, blowing right over his previous final statement by going directly into the next topic.
I did expect you to ask me why I did what I did.
Though he deliberately kept it vague, he was more than likely referring to his intervention during the attack on that abomination that now prowled the streets of this hallowed station. Though he did not expect Reprig to take a quite so sharp left turn in this conversation, Navmir Doralfriend managed to not blunder yet again. Adapting quickly to the diversion of the exchange, he simply put on a tone of mild, pleasant amusement as he replied,
"Now why would I ask something so stupid?"
Tilting his head to look more directly down at the much, much smaller man, he made a rolling motion with one end of his trunk before lifting both halves into a pleased Y shape.
"You saw an attack, you could intervene, so you intervened."
He described his view of the situation, at least as far as the public setting they were in needed to be aware of.
"There is really not much to explain. Your training didn't care who it was that was being attacked. You simply saw someone in danger and you acted."
A noise escaped Reprig at that statement, one that sounded like an actual honest-to-goodness snort of all things.
"If you say so,
he replied only a second later, seemingly needing a moment to actively suppress amusement, though it still bled through into his voice. The bull narrowed his eyes at this odd demeanour. Was he an idiot? Did he want to pull unnecessary attention onto his actions? What was his angle here? Nafmir Duralfriend didn't like this. Not at all. And so he decided to quickly switch the topic once again. Though, in order to probe this strange behaviour further, he decided to go for one that may just reveal which way the Sipper's Lane was truly leaning.
Well, who knows? The cyborg may still want to thank you. I'm sure you're aware they have made their way to this station as well,
he informed, as if in passing first, before lifting his trunk to rub his forehead almost a bit awkwardly, as if he had just remembered something uncomfortable.
Though, of course, they aren't the only one here you have history with. Since we were on the topic of unpleasant people earlier, are you sure you were in the right condition to step before your old tormentor once again? After all, he left an impression on you that I am sure is quite hard to forget.
In a subtly unsubtle motion, he gestured downwards, drawing his trunk's tip in the direction of Reprig's missing leg, and the walking aid he needed because of it. Reprig gave a rather unimpressed hum as his first answer.
I have managed to banish him from my nightmares quite a while ago,
he then elaborated further, after giving himself a few seconds, either to formulate his answer, or to simply keep his tone under control.
Besides that, I already met him a couple of times since those days, without much trouble, and it would also be quite pathetic of me to still cower at the idea of standing before him, considering everything he has faced since that day.
At first, it seemed like his sentence was meant to end there. However, as his voice was already fading out, Reprig seemed to think better of it and spoke back up, this time lifting his head to give the Zodiatos bull an almost prodding look.
However, if that is what you are concerned about, I can assure you, he said, lowering his voice a bit, almost as if he wanted to make it sound more ominous, though the slightly amused hint that came along with it worked against that assumption. He then left a dramatic pause, seeming to enjoy adding a little bit of theatrics to his statement, before he finally finished with,
"He has gotten no less terrifying in the meantime." Admittedly, this time it was Nafmir Duralfriend who couldn't quite help but let out a noise of amusement, as the statement tickled a certain part of his brain. He had, after all, already stood before the human himself. It was one of the first things he did when he had come to this station. Of course, he knew about his capabilities, and he was taking them into account. The man was capable, that much was for certain. But terrifying?
And I suppose you expect me to simply take the word of a coward?
He challenged, deciding to throw the self-admittance of the warrant officer back into his face, mostly just to see how the man would react. He hadn't expected any huge reaction, and indeed Reprig remained almost immaculately calm about the direct attack on him. He simply wiggled his trunk in place, almost as if something was tickling him, and stretched his unoccupied arm out. It was a gesture of relaxation, of loosening up.
I suppose that entirely depends. Would you rather trust the assessment of a living coward?
He then said, in an entirely nonchalant voice, his tail giving a single passing bob from left to right. His eyes were still on the bull's face, and he didn't change his expression in the slightest as he finished his question with,
"Or the dead one?"
Nafmir Duralfriend's eyes widened ever so slightly, the implications of the statements immediately becoming clear to him. It seemed like the Deathworlder's faith in him was about as limited as his own was the other way around. So, in Reprig's eyes, he was to join the pile of Duralfriend corpses that was starting to build up at humanity's feet, was he? It almost seemed like the little vermin had more respect for their opposition than he did for the highest male of one of, no, the greatest of the core welders. A simple leftover of the man's dislike for his predecessor, or a sign that maybe his little incident in that courthouse had only been a sign of more things to come. Or just maybe. Once again, Nafmir Duralfriend's gaze wandered down a bit, landing on the area where the ever so slightly blurry small silhouette was very obviously missing a chunk. This time, he didn't simply allude to it in mocking, but instead took a moment to actually take it in. Although the warrant officer had been out of the action for quite a long time now, and despite some rather questionable choices in the recent past, there was one thing that the Colossus could not deny. Out of everyone, this man was the one who had been right on the humans' heels the longest. Technically, the Captain Uton had known the Mad Councilman slightly longer. However, the Primate's role was never meant to be quite as involved with him as that of his fellow Deathworlder was. Reprig had been there since the first days, kept a hidden eye on the then ambassador when nobody else had any idea about just how deep his waters ran yet. That wasn't to say he had always known best, of course. Quite the opposite. But maybe that was just as valuable. Reprig had made the mistake of underestimating the man possibly more than anybody else. So, if one wished to assume he was still wrong about Aldwyn, wasn't it more reasonable that the trend would continue than it was to assume he suddenly thought far too highly of the human? And if it was the responsible thing to think that Reprig might still underestimate the man, and yet Reprig already thought of Aldwyn as someone who Nafmir Durofren was more than likely to ironically come up short against?
I will keep that in mind,
the bull finally mumbled, his trunk thoughtfully stroking along the smooth length of one of his tusks. Admittedly, he wasn't entirely sure if he was actually just following the most reasonable process of deduction, or if he had simply taken Reprig's bait. But one thing was for certain. He had absolutely no desire to join those who died as idiots. Reprig sighed as he leaned back into the way too large armchair that he had laboriously climbed upon after he arrived in the High Matriarch's local abode. Of course, he was more than just a little used to furniture that was far too large for him. However, that didn't make it a whole lot easier to actually maneuver it, while having one of his more essential for climbing limbs missing. And the crutch wasn't exactly a great help with climbing either. Still, he was up here now, and he could finally relax. Admittedly, the trip to come here had taken quite a bit out of him, especially so since he had been on his feet basically since he had fired that shot in the courthouse before it. He hardly remembered the last time he had any real sleep, and while that was not a problem for his specifically evolved brain, his muscles were a whole nother story. They certainly demanded more rest than the occasional sitting down. Well, right now, he would have time for that. The High Matriarch's plans still needed a bit of time in the oven before they could be fully set into motion. His attempts to try and get a conversation with Captain Uton had been shot down, as it seemed like the man really didn't want to see anybody right now, but likely specifically not anybody like Reprig. After all, Uton knew very well of the time and effort Reprig had spent to make sure Skye was actually eating while she was under the High Matriarch's custody. The hours he had put into trying to teach the girl to speak more properly. The end of his trunk lifted up so he could bite it, trying to suppress a bit of a sting in his mind. Was it just a bad joke that he would try to prop himself up as the one to judge now? He sincerely wondered if there had been a time when he wouldn't have blinked at Captain Uton's latest actions. He wondered if caring now was in any way a sign of growth, or if it was simply pathetic and nothing else. Then again, it wasn't like he could simply ignore that feeling in his gut. Joke or not, pathetic or not, he did care. It was just so cruel, so needlessly violent towards somebody who, whether she was truly convinced of it or not, had done nothing but help further the cause. Sure, for her, it may have been a transaction, but even if it was one where she had kept her end of the deal. And this was the thanks she got? He liked to believe that. Even if she was a rather obnoxious dissident, he still wouldn't have approved of this in the past, just like he wouldn't have walked out of a store without paying, simply because the cashier was a high-class Deathworlder. Now, admittedly, it was questionable if he would have shopped there in the first place, had that been the case. But if he did, he certainly would have paid. A transaction was a matter of order, after all. Well, either way, that course of action had been thoroughly struck down, as he had no way of finding the captain if he didn't want to be found at this time. And, well, the thing that he certainly wanted to do now that he was here, which was achievable, was to take a moment to personally meet with HFY, both to talk things out and to solemnly congratulate her for her ascendance to the council, no matter the way she had taken to get there. However, not only would she be exceptionally busy with council work this soon after her inauguration, and the last thing she would need right now was therefore a meeting, as tensely charged as that one would be, he also had just enough pride in himself left to not want to step before her, or any of the newly ascended council members, or their coterie for that matter, in his current state. He would have to rest first. Rest, recover a bit, and clean up. Then he could face them. Who knew? Maybe they would even allow him to say a few words to Sky. He almost immediately scoffed at his own words. Yeah, right. Fat chance that. Even if he had done exactly one thing they would approve of by now, he doubted he would appear on any of their whitelists anytime soon. James was, no doubt, a forgiving man. But, yeah, not that forgiving. And if he was honest with himself, Reprig wouldn't have wanted to ask for that either. In this case, things were probably better the more they stayed the same. Resigning himself to take some questionably deserved but much needed rest, he simply laid in the eerie silence of the large room for a bit, until he was disturbed by the sudden ringing of his personal assistant. Shooting up a bit at the shrill noise, he quickly moved to pick up the incoming call. He scowled as he saw that it came from a suppressed caller. However, at the same time, that was neither surprising nor rare these days. "Hello?" he asked, once he saw that the connection had been built. Hi. A very familiar, incredibly melodic voice came from the other side. Good to hear your voice again. It was a strange experience to hear a voice that he had in the past associated with always being quite glad to hear it, only to now feel a very dark, sinking feeling in his stomach at its sound. You really shouldn't contact me, HFY, he said in a flat tone, not even able to force himself into some sort of pleasant greeting. Ever since the attack on Goalitin, HFY had gone into deep hiding, and for very good reason. After all, she was openly accused of being directly involved in the death of none other than Councilman Afyana. Relax, HFY replied to his warning, with the typical sound of plucked strings. This connection is perfectly secure. No need to worry about it. She was quiet for a few moments, seemingly expecting Reprig to give some sort of quip or comment as an answer. Instead, there was just dead silence. After it had lasted for about 10 whole seconds, HFY carefully spoke up again. Listen, she said hesitantly, almost as if she was expecting Reprig to explode at any moment. We didn't know he was still in the building. In fact, we were sure that he had left. Otherwise, we would have never given the go-ahead. Once again, she paused, as if she wanted to give Reprig space to reply. And once again, he remained quiet. When we inserted the loop into the cameras, that meant our own vision of the place went dead as well. HFY quickly went on with her explanation, once it became clear that Reprig wasn't going to say anything. And his keycard had been... She tried to explain further, though as she spoke, it seemed like her own turmoil about the situation was getting the better of her. In many other situations, it may have been questionable if she was merely putting on an act to try and push blame away from herself. But not right now. Reprig knew HFY for many years. He knew when she was being genuine. And the way her string instrument-like voice dampened and sounded like someone had thrown a wet cloth over the strings before they were strummed was real, actual distress. Distress that she was likely comfortable to express like this, with few people apart from himself. His keycard had been used to leave the building. At least, the record said so. She managed to force out, after a few moments of trying to collect herself. I don't know how it happened. He still had it with him when he... She cut off there, and she really didn't need to say any more. What about the others? Reprig asked. He didn't doubt what HFY said. He was sure she certainly would have protested had she believed that Afyana was still in the building. But in the end, He wasn't the only one there.
Did you think they were out too?
HFY was quiet for a few long moments.
I had my orders,
she then said, her voice somewhat controlled again, even if the dampening of her emotional outburst was still there. Reprig felt another pang in his stomach. He hated that that was her explanation. And he hated that she had every reason to assume it would be enough of an explanation for him. He didn't tend to question orders, after all.
And,
she then, however, unexpectedly continued, making him listen up.
After everything, after what he did, after your leg, and Duralfren, and Tess.
She released a quick chord of a sharp half hiss, half sob.
If only it had hit him,
she said, in a deep, almost growl, at least as close as a Khoivri could get to growling. Reprig exhaled slowly. He didn't really know how to feel about that addition. He licked at his trunk as the nervous tick from his past came through once again. And he decided to pivot to the only part of her statement he was somewhat comfortable talking to her about right now.
How is Tess? Any idea?
He asked, as he himself had not heard from the Xanthai in basically forever.
Nothing,
HFY replied almost immediately.
He's gone completely dark. I don't even know if he's still alive.
Reprig nodded to himself. So she didn't know either.
I think he's fine somewhere, he stated.
He didn't quite know why he believed that. Maybe it was just wishful thinking. In the end, Tassil had never been quite like them. Wherever he had gone, he was most likely happier there.
I hope you're right,
HFY simply replied, without a hint of dishonesty. There was another bit of pressing silence, although it wasn't quite as intense this time. It was more that both of them were at a loss for words for a bit.
So,
Reprig was the one to finally break the silence, awkwardly scratching at his neck as he spoke.
Do you have new orders yet?
I'm on standby, but I'm supposed to stay close to the council station,
HFY replied.
The implication is something big is about to happen.
Reprig scowled a bit, but couldn't say he was surprised.
Yeah, he confirmed. That's what I've gathered as well.